Beneath a vast, unblemished heavens, on the 8th of May in the year 1945, the central Nebraska plains remained saturated from the previous night's downpour. The aroma of freshly tilled soil blended with the subtle hint of diesel fumes emanating from the vehicles lining the unpaved roadway. The European conflict had concluded mere hours prior. Yet here, a hemisphere away, the sense of triumph manifested not as jubilant parades or cascades of confetti, but as an uncanny stillness, as if the very atmosphere held its breath. Beyond the metallic strands of Camp Atlanta's perimeter, a contingent of young women stood in precise rows, their footwear darkened by mud. Some gazed towards the emergent sun, painting the prairie in hues of gold, while others kept their eyes cast downwards, hands clasped behind their backs, as if intentionally concealing their apprehension from their American captors. Weeks earlier, they had been apprehended, some in France, others on airfields or in devastated field hospitals, and transported across the ocean, not as free individuals, but as prisoners of war. The existence of female combatants had largely escaped the notice of the American populace. They were nurses, support staff, administrative personnel. Yet there they stood, their complexions pale, their frames weary from the arduous train journey, arranged beside the dusty enclosure, like students misplaced from their institution. The situation possessed an almost theatrical irony. America's newest adversaries were young women who, back in their homelands, might have been serving meals or tending to the wounded, their presence redolent of antiseptic. Now they faced the unbroken expanse of a foreign landscape, starkly different from the Europe they had known. The American sentinels maintained a watchful, yet not overtly hostile, gaze. The atmosphere was less one of tension and more one of intrigue. Lieutenant Harris, the youthful officer overseeing the processing, could not overlook their incongruous presentation, their hair meticulously braided, their skirts pressed despite the protracted travel. They hardly resemble individuals prone to causing trouble, one non-commissioned officer remarked, idly manipulating a toothpick. Just appear exhausted. The women remained largely silent, save for a hushed exchange between two, a rapid, soft cascade of German words that carried a prayer-like quality. Harris, possessing a sufficient grasp of German to discern fragments, believed he detected the term for sustenance. The camp itself defied conventional notions of a detention facility. It comprised a collection of modest wooden barracks, a structure for food preparation emitting a plume of smoke from its chimney, a facility for laundry, and a modest chapel. Fencing was present, certainly, but devoid of armed guard towers or spotlights sweeping the grounds after dark. Throughout the conflict, the United States had established numerous such facilities, not solely for internment, but to leverage the labor potential of the incarcerated. Farmers, facing a critical shortage of manpower for their harvests and industries, requiring a workforce to sustain production while many American men served abroad, found a practical solution. Utilize prisoner labor. The arrangement involved provisions for sustenance, lodging, a modest wage, and eventual repatriation upon the cessation of hostilities. By all accounts, this system proved effective, although it did occasion surprise among many civilians to witness individuals in German uniforms in their communities. For the women, their initial hours were a disorienting blur of commands and actions. They were provided with fresh linens, subjected to health inspections, and escorted to their accommodations, barracks with a faint scent of wood shavings and soap. The clang of a bell from the mess hall summoned them to long communal tables laden with steaming plates of potatoes, cornbread, beans, and slices of roasted pork, a more abundant meal than some had encountered in many months. One of the nurses, a tall, freckled young woman named Annalise, paused before partaking, a flicker of suspicion crossing her features. When no intervention occurred, she took a bite, emitting a sound that conveyed a mixture of relief and astonishment. Others followed suit, and soon the hall resonated with the gentle clinking of cutlery and the low hum of conversation. Outside, a few American guards observed their charges, feigning unawareness of the nascent smiles gracing the women's faces for the first time since their arrival. It was not camaraderie, not yet. They remained captives, and some harbored resentment at their apprehension, believing they had merely been fulfilling their duties. However, a subtle shift was discernible in the air, an almost imperceptible easing of ingrained tension. They were alive, they were nourished, and they were no longer confined to makeshift shelters or damaged infirmaries. For the first time in months, the sweet melodies of birdsong replaced the cacophony of artillery. Beyond the wire, curious local residents began to congregate. Children on bicycles would pedal past, eager for a glimpse. Housewives en route to the market would slow their vehicles, craning their necks. Some anticipated encountering monstrous figures, but instead observed young women with braided hair, sleeves rolled up, engaged in washing clothes or peeling vegetables in the shade of the kitchen building. A few of the more daring youngsters offered whistles, eliciting reprimands from their mothers but eliciting broad smiles from the prisoners. It evolved into an unspoken spectacle, this quiet tableau of everyday existence. Americans observing with wonder, Germans who appeared so entirely ordinary. Moments of discord did arise. Not everyone, naturally, relished the proximity of the enemy. One farmer was reported to have spat on the ground near the fence, muttering about his brother's demise in Normandy. The women witnessed this but remained silent, though that night one of them wept into her pillow. Annalise, awake on the bunk above, listened and recalled the hospital tents she had left behind. The rows of wounded soldiers whose eyes had pleaded for relief, for water, for news of an imminent end to the war. Perhaps, she mused, this was the conclusion they had prayed for. An opportunity to simply exist as human beings once more, albeit within confinement. By the second week, a semblance of camp routine had established itself. The women were assigned to various labor details. Some were dispatched to local farms to assist with planting and harvesting, traveling each morning in open trucks, the prairie wind whipping through their hair. Others worked in the camp laundry, enveloped in steam and the heavy aroma of soap. A small infirmary even existed, where two of the nurses aided an American medical officer in treating a range of ailments, from sunburn to sprained ankles. Gradually, almost reluctantly, a semblance of order emerged. What most surprised the women was the palpable absence of brutality. They had been conditioned by propaganda to anticipate harsh treatment, potentially even violence, from the Americans. Instead, they received equitable rations and participated in Sunday chapel services. They were compensated with vouchers exchangeable at the camp canteen for toiletries, confectionery, and even stationery for correspondence with their families. Initially, their letters home comprised factual reports, carefully worded to avoid any hint of disloyalty. However, as weeks elapsed, their correspondence softened, detailing fresh milk, comfortable bedding, and even cordial exchanges with the guards. They addressed me as Annie now, Annalise wrote in one letter, and one of them taught me a new word, howdy. It made me laugh. Lieutenant Harris also noted the evolving atmosphere. During his patrols, he observed the women beginning to smile, offering hesitant nods of greeting to the guards. Some even attempted to converse in English, their speech faltering but earnest. One evening, he passed the recreation hall and heard singing. It was not the martial anthems of their former training, but gentle folk melodies, voices intertwining in harmonies that lent the night an unexpected softness. For a fleeting instant, Harris forgot their status as prisoners. They sounded like any group of young women rediscovering a sense of security. Nevertheless, instances occurred where the grim realities of war intruded. One afternoon, a telegram arrived for one of the women, conveying news of her father's death in an aerial bombardment back home. She sat on the barrack steps, her gaze fixed on the message, until another prisoner placed an arm around her shoulders. No guards intervened. They maintained a respectful distance, hats in hand. Despite the camp's many small comforts, it could not assuage the profound grief carried across the vast ocean. As summer reached its zenith, the prairie burst into a riot of wildflowers, and the women began to leave subtle imprints of their presence upon the camp. They cultivated a vibrant row of crimson geraniums outside the barracks. They fashioned and hung hand-embroidered curtains in the windows. To a casual observer, the camp might have appeared almost idyllic, reminiscent of a school or a rural sanctuary. Yet, the fences remained, and at intervals, the women would stand by them, their gazes fixed on the distant road, as if attempting to envision the flavor of liberty once more. On the day hostilities officially ceased in the Pacific Theater, the camp erupted in a cacophony of sounds, bells, whistles, and joyous shouts. The Americans engaged in dancing and embraced one another. Even the prisoners offered quiet cheers, their hearts filled with relief that the bloodshed had finally ended. However, a new uncertainty settled upon them, like a fine dust. What lay ahead? Rumors circulated regarding imminent repatriation, the prospect of being transported back across the ocean to a nation they scarcely recognized. Some eagerly anticipated the journey, others experienced an unnamed melancholy. Despite its confines, this camp had evolved into a sanctuary, a harbor of hope. That evening, as the prairie sky ignited with the fiery hues of sunset, Annalise sat on the stoop of the barracks, listening to the faint strains of American radio emanating from the guard post. The lively, bright rhythm of swing jazz filled the air. She realized she was smiling. She also comprehended that departing this place might evoke a pang of sorrow more profound than anticipated. Deep within, a transformation had occurred. This land, this improbable haven, had begun to feel like a quiet assurance. Yet, she suspected this assurance could dissipate as swiftly as it had emerged. Beyond the enclosure, a world awaited, a world that offered no gentle reception. The prairie summer was relentless, its brilliance bleaching the grasses to a pale gold, transforming the barbed wire into glinting threads against the horizon. By July, the women had seamlessly integrated into the camp's established cadence, rising with the dawn, laboring until the lengthening shadows, sleeping beneath a sky so expansive it rendered them insignificant. The air thrummed with the incessant buzz of cicadas, a sound that penetrated the barracks, mingling with the scrape of boots on wooden floors and the occasional burst of laughter, surprising even those who initiated it. Warfare had instilled in them a habit of suppressing mirth, but here it began to resurface, tentative as a deer emerging from woodland. Annalise naturally assumed leadership of her work detail, partly due to her clearer command of English, and partly because of the tranquil demeanor she projected, offering reassurance to the others. Each morning, she and approximately a dozen other women would clamber into the rear of a flatbed truck, their skirts billowing in the wind as the vehicle rumbled down the dirt track towards a farm situated 10 miles distant. The farm exuded the scent of sun-warmed hay and honest labor, and the women commenced their tasks, meticulously weeding rows of beans, diligently tying tomato plants, and transporting heavy buckets of water until their palms were raw and blistered. Initially, their efforts were accompanied by silence, but this quietude soon gave way. One woman would hum a familiar melody from home. Another would join in, and before long, the fields echoed with their harmonious singing. The farmer, a man with a stooped posture and skin weathered like leather, would lean on his shovel, listening, a faint spectral smile gracing his lips. For the local townspeople, the sight of German women laboring on their land became a daily spectacle. Children would perch on fence posts, observing intently, whispering amongst themselves. Occasionally, they would risk approaching the fence, offering small tokens, an apple, a piece of chalk, and tossing them over, giggling as the women stooped to retrieve them. The first time this occurred, a guard brusquely ordered them to desist. However, Annalise simply held up the apple and offered a smile. The tension gradually dissipated. By the close of that month, the children no longer tossed gifts from a distance. They approached directly to the gate, passing their offerings through the wire, as if the fence were merely a demarcation in the earth. Evenings within the camp became increasingly lively. The women organized impromptu musical performances, utilizing combs wrapped in paper as makeshift instruments, their rendition of folk songs drawing the guards closer, almost against their will. Some of the American soldiers brought out their own guitars, engaging in friendly song exchanges and laughing at the varied accents. For a period, the camp transformed into something else, less a place of confinement and more a peculiar settlement, where former adversaries found themselves sharing melodies beneath the moonlit sky. Lieutenant Harris would sometimes stand at the periphery of these gatherings, his hands clasped behind his back, ostensibly supervising, but in reality, captivated by the music. He pondered if this was how peace might sound, not through pronouncements or treaties, but through voices ascending in unison through the darkness. However, not all embraced the growing warmth between captors and the captured. Letters arrived from nearby towns, cautioning against treating the enemy with excessive kindness, arguing they did not merit music or smiles while American soldiers lay interred overseas. The camp commandant reviewed these letters with a frown, but initiated no alterations. "The war has concluded," he stated simply. "We adhere to the Geneva Protocols." Consequently, the camp maintained its small acts of kindness, even as discontent festered beyond its boundaries. For the women, these gestures of goodwill were both a solace and a source of torment. It was simpler to harbor animosity towards an enemy who remained consistently cruel, yet here they were provided with quality bread, hot coffee, and equitable compensation. Small rolls of coupons, redeemable for soap, candy, or writing materials, became cherished possessions. Some began accumulating these coupons for minor indulgences, tucking away chocolate bars to savor on Sunday afternoons. Others utilized them to acquire ink and stationery for lengthy letters to their families. These letters grew progressively bolder as the weeks advanced. They described the cornfields, the immensity of the sky, and the peculiar amiability of Americans who tipped their hats and addressed them as Miss. Initially, the letters were brief and reserved. By August, they read like personal confessions, filled with an astonishment that life as a prisoner could, in certain respects, feel more liberating than life during wartime. Annalise found herself caught between disparate realities. She had enlisted in the military nursing corps with a sense of national pride, believing she was contributing to her country's cause. Yet, here, in the heartland of America, she began to question all that she had been led to believe. The propaganda portraying Americans as malevolent figures seemed utterly preposterous when contrasted with the farmer's wife, who offered her a slice of pie one afternoon, or the medic who patiently demonstrated how to properly splint a sprained wrist. She still yearned for her homeland, a pang arising when she recalled her mother's kitchen or the familiar church bells of her village. However, a seed had been sown, one she found increasingly difficult to dislodge. The notion that the adversary might not be the villain, after all. A quiet conflict brewed within the barracks. Not every woman welcomed this shift in perspective. Some remained staunchly loyal to the Reich, grumbling that the others were succumbing to leniency. One evening, after a laborious day in the fields, Annalise discovered a small pamphlet tucked into her blanket, a brittle, yellowing piece of propaganda urging resistance and the preservation of hatred. She stared at it for a considerable time before tearing it in half and discarding it into the stove. The ashes curled and drifted like dark snowflakes. The act was minor, yet it felt like an act of betrayal against her former self. One evening in the late summer, a tempest gathered and swept across the plains. The sky turned an ominous green, the wind howled with ferocity, and rain hammered the corrugated tin roofs with such intensity that the women could barely hear one another speak. Lightning illuminated the compound in stark flashes, revealing guards scrambling for shelter and trucks huddled together like frightened livestock near the perimeter fence. Within the barracks, the women clustered for comfort, some murmuring prayers, others singing softly to steady their nerves. Annalise found herself seated beside a young American guard whose post had been inundated by the storm. He was drenched to the bone, his cap drooping forlornly. For a prolonged interval, silence prevailed between them, broken only by the resonant rumble of thunder. Finally, he offered a sheepish grin and remarked, "Guess we're all in the same boat tonight." She laughed, surprised by the natural, unforced sound of her own amusement. When the storm finally abated, the air was imbued with a sense of pristine cleanness, as if something more substantial than mere rain had been washed away. By the advent of autumn, the camp had acquired a peculiar sense of shared community. The harvest season kept everyone engaged, and the women earned accolades from the farmers for their competence and dedication. "They work harder than some of my own neighbors," one farmer admitted, his observation delivered with a chuckle that belied its underlying truth. The women took genuine pride in such praise, walking a little straighter as they reboarded the trucks each evening. They began to sing during the journey home, and even the driver would find himself tapping the steering wheel in time with the melody. For Annalise, the most significant transformation manifested in the form of trust. One afternoon, the guard escorting her crew to the farm requested that she hold his clipboard and tally the hours worked. It was a minor assignment, yet it felt like a profound gesture of faith, as if he believed implicitly in her honesty. She proved him correct. Upon returning the clipboard, he offered a nod, and something within her chest felt as though it had loosened. The fence no longer appeared quite so formidable, but subtle reminders persisted that this fragile equilibrium was temporary. Whispers of repatriation orders began circulating, permeating the barracks like spectral tales, spoken in hushed tones late at night when the camp settled into quietude. Some women wept at the prospect of returning to cities reduced to rubble. Others grew restless, pacing the perimeter fence as if willing the departure date to arrive sooner. Annalise felt a profound internal conflict. A part of her yearned to be reunited with her mother, to tread once more the familiar paths of her childhood. Yet another part dreaded leaving this place where she had encountered a startling revelation. that life could still hold moments of gentleness, even in the aftermath of profound horror. On a crisp October morning, as frost traced delicate patterns on the grass, Lieutenant Harris visited the barracks, bearing a stack of official forms. "We require names for the repatriation rosters," he announced, his voice steady and even. The women gathered around, murmuring amongst themselves. When Annalise's turn arrived, she hesitated, the pen poised above the paper. Her name appeared strangely on the document, as if it belonged to someone else entirely. She signed it nonetheless, keenly aware of the weight carried by each individual letter. As she returned the form, she met Harris's gaze. For a moment, neither spoke. Then, he remarked quietly, "It won't be much longer now." She nodded, unsure whether her gesture signified acceptance or apprehension. That night, as the lanterns in the barracks were extinguished one by one, Annalise lay awake, listening to the distant, mournful whistle of a train. She imagined it was the very train that would convey them away, back across the vast ocean, back to the desolation, the hunger, and the memories they had striven to escape. But then her thoughts drifted to the farm fields bathed in the warm glow of sunset, to the American guard's sheepish grin during the storm, to the apple gently pressed through the fence by a child's small hand. These recollections clung to her, as persistent as the scent of prairie rain. She did not know which would follow her home with greater tenacity, the enduring pain of war or the unexpected kindness of the adversary. Somewhere beyond the barbed wire, winter was on its inexorable approach, heralding the conclusion of their peculiar, suspended season. The first frost clung to the camp fence like delicate spun glass. When the official directives finally arrived, a telegram dispatched from Washington, bearing an official stamp, and by mid-morning, the guards were affixing notices to the mess hall door. Repatriation was slated to commence within the week. Trucks were already being requisitioned and vessels booked. The women congregated around the announcement, their breath misting in the frigid air, their countenances a complex mixture of relief, dread, and disbelief. After months of predictable routine, the prospect of departure felt almost surreal, as if the snow globe of their lives had been shaken, setting everything into a tumultuous swirl. Annalise read the notice twice before stepping back, her fingers gripping the edge of her coat as though seeking an anchor. Around her, the others murmured in low tones, some weeping openly, others beaming as if the festive season had arrived prematurely. For those who had spent the summer yearning for their native soil, this was the answer to their earnest prayers. But for Annalise, a peculiar heaviness settled upon her chest. She had envisioned this day for many months, and now that it was upon them, the envisioned reality felt strangely hollow. She had seen the photographs of Germany sent by distant relatives, streets reduced to ruin, church spires toppled, children with vacant eyes waiting in breadlines. The thought of re-entering that world sent a chill through her that surpassed the biting Nebraska wind. In the subsequent days, the camp pulsed with a frantic, almost feverish energy. Luggage was prepared, correspondence penned, and farewells exchanged across the barrier with farmers and custodians who had evolved into something akin to companions. The women diligently polished the living quarters until the wood gleamed, as if meticulous tidiness might alleviate the sting of departure. The guards were notably subdued, their customary jests muted, their gazes deliberately averted from the internees. Lieutenant Harris conducted his patrol with uncharacteristic leisure, pausing to converse with individuals he had come to recognize by name. Upon reaching Annalise's section, he found her by her cot, folding a borrowed coverlet. "You'll be departing in 2 days," he informed her. "Yes," she responded, her own voice sounding unfamiliar. He hesitated, as if contemplating further remarks. "It's a challenging transition, returning." She met his gaze, truly observing him, committing to memory the subtle lines etched at the corners of his eyes and the weather-chapped texture of his lips. "It feels as though I'm leaving 2 distinct realms," she murmured. "One is shattered, and the other resides here." He offered a curt nod, a small, constrained gesture, and turned away before the moment could intensify. The morning designated for their exodus was piercingly frigid, the sky a vast, pale gray expanse. Vehicles were positioned outside the entrance, their engines humming, and the women emerged with their scant possessions, suitcases bearing the marks of travel, and bedrolls secured with twine. The guards stood at attention, their hats pulled low as if bracing against more than merely the wind. As the vehicles pulled away, some of the women offered waves, others kept their hands clasped in their laps, their gazes fixed straight ahead. The facility receded behind them, eventually vanishing entirely, leaving only the lingering image of crimson flowers adorning the barrack walls. The journey back to Germany was protracted and arduous. Initially, they traveled by train, the carriage rattling across vast stretches of prairie, then through the sprawling industrial landscapes of cities they had only encountered in publications. At the harbor, they boarded a transport vessel redolent with the sense of brine and corrosion. The Atlantic in winter presented itself as a tempestuous gray entity, buffeting the ship to the extent that even the most robust constitutions succumbed. Many were overcome by sickness, their faces ashen, their grip tight on the railings. The nights proved the most trying, dark, unending stretches where the waves crashed against the hull, and the prospect of the future loomed like a specter. Annalise shared a compact compartment with 3 other women. The air was heavy with the aroma of damp wool and apprehension. Conversation was sparse, each woman absorbed in her own reflections. Late one night, one of them whispered, "What if my village no longer exists?" No one offered a reply. The question hung in the atmosphere like dissipating smoke before dissolving into silence. Upon their eventual arrival in Bremerhaven, the scene that greeted them surpassed any harrowing vision. The port resembled a charnel house of mangled metal and demolished stone. The atmosphere was oppressive, thick with coal fumes and the acrid sting of burnt timber. Vessels lay partially submerged in the harbor, their masts protruding like fractured teeth. The women disembarked in a state of stunned bewilderment, clutching their bags, their exhalations forming clouds in the biting air. American vehicles stood ready to convey them inland, and as they climbed aboard, the sheer magnitude of what awaited them began to weigh upon their spirits. The thoroughfares were flanked by devastation. In village after village, they observed dwellings stripped of their roofs, streets cratered, and walls blackened by fire. Children, their faces gaunt and pale, their attire patched and ill-fitting, darted amongst the debris. Elderly women, their backs bent like question marks, carried buckets of water from frozen wells. Pervasive hunger permeated the air, accompanied by a silence so profound it seemed to absorb all sound. Annalise's own village was virtually unrecognizable. The church had lost its spire, the schoolhouse stood as a hollow shell, and the residence where she had grown up was missing a significant portion of its roof. Her mother met her at the threshold, appearing diminished and aged beyond her years, her countenance etched with worry and deprivation. They embraced without utterance, tears freezing upon their cheeks. Within, the house carried the scent of cold embers and cabbage stew. They partook of a meal in near silence, each mouthful a stark reminder of the prevailing scarcity of sustenance. That evening, Annalise lay awake on a straw-filled mattress, listening to the wind's mournful cry through the breach in the roof. In the ensuing weeks, she began to recognize the profound transformation she had undergone. She volunteered her assistance in the reconstruction of the schoolhouse, her hands chafing from handling bricks, her back aching. Initially, the other villagers regarded her with a weary skepticism. She had returned from America, a land perceived as a realm of unimaginable abundance. However, when she spoke of the internment facility, of the meager sustenance, the labor, and the unexpected kindnesses she had encountered, they paid heed. Her words, hesitant at first, gained strength, imbued with the perspective of one who had encountered the adversary and perceived their humanity. She was not alone in this experience. Across Germany, former prisoners of war, men and women alike, shared parallel narratives. They recounted instances of equitable treatment, remuneration, and the acquisition of English language skills and American melodies. They spoke of farmers who offered them coffee, of guards who introduced them to baseball, and of the initial taste of chocolate following years of austerity. Gradually, these accounts began to interweave with the tapestry of post-war existence, tempering the prevailing bitterness sufficiently to allow the seeds of hope to sprout. Correspondence commenced arriving from America, dispatched by farmers and guards who had formed bonds with their former captives. Subsequently, packages followed, containing modest provisions of flour, sugar, tinned milk, and even footwear. For a nation grappling with severe deprivation throughout the winter of 1946, these represented immeasurable treasures. Annalise assisted in their distribution, moving from dwelling to dwelling, her arms laden with brown paper parcels. At each doorstep, she explained the origin of the gifts, and at each doorstep, the recipient's eyes widened in disbelief. Their former adversaries were providing for them. Not everyone was prepared for reconciliation. There were those who reacted with disdain at any mention of America, who cursed the ordinance that had reduced their cities to rubble. Nevertheless, the acts of generosity could not be dismissed. Children who had grown up amidst the ruins now carried American confectionaries in their pockets. Farmers commenced rebuilding efforts utilizing materials provided through the Marshall Plan. The very vehicles that had once transported internees now delivered relief supplies. For Annalise, this societal shift held a deeply personal significance. She began to correspond with the camp medic, whose diligent instruction had aided her in caring for the infirm during that summer. Their letters, initially cautious, evolved into warmer exchanges, replete with particulars of daily existence on both continents. He apprised her of the harvest, of a gathering held in the town hall, and of the birth of his niece. She recounted her involvement in the schoolhouse restoration, describing children reciting lessons in the cold, their breath misting in the frigid air. His correspondence became a vital connection, a reminder that the world could still harbor benevolence. One afternoon, while observing children frolicking in the snow in the schoolyard, a representative from the Allied administration arrived, carrying a clipboard. He explained that he was conducting interviews to ascertain public sentiment. When it was her turn, he inquired if she harbored animosity towards the Americans. She reflected on the internment facility, on the tempest and the singing, on the farmer's spouse who had offered her a slice of pie. She considered the packages currently gracing kitchen tables throughout the village. "No," she stated finally, her voice clear and resolute. "I believe they provided us with an opportunity to commence anew." Word of her sentiment spread through the village, and soon others began to voice similar opinions. They were weary of animosity, weary of hunger. If camaraderie with the Americans could furnish sustenance, warmth, and optimism, then so be it. Meetings were convened, and committees were formed to orchestrate reconstruction initiatives with American support. By springtime, the schoolhouse was complete, its windows gleaming, its bell once again pealing. The initial visit by an American officer to assess the progress found Annalise standing at the doorway, her apron dusted with plaster, greeting him in English. The words felt peculiar, yet comforting on her tongue, forming a conduit between the two worlds she now inhabited. He offered a smile, tipping his hat, and for an instant, the war seemed like a distant event that had happened to someone else entirely. Yet, even as life began to re-emerge, a question persisted. The global landscape was fracturing into Eastern and Western blocs, delineating boundaries that would shape subsequent decades. Whispers of emergent perils circulated through the towns. Soviet forces were observed in the east, and espionage activities were reported in the cities. The Americans were no longer simply former adversaries. They had become protectors, allies against a different form of encroaching darkness. Annalise pondered her potential role in this evolving chapter. Would she continue to advocate for reconciliation, to recount her experiences? Or would the impending storm compel her to once again choose a side? On the evening of her 25th birthday, she sat with her mother by the stove, the two of them mending garments by lamplight. Outside, snow drifted silently, muffling the world. A letter lay on the table, the latest from the camp medic, extending an invitation to visit should she ever find herself back in America. She traced the words with her fingertip, sensing the pull of two realms, one of desolation and reconstruction, the other of open skies and now dismantled barbed wire. The lamp flickered, casting elongated shadows across the room, and she felt a shift in the atmosphere, as if history itself were holding its breath. In the distance, a train whistle sounded, a low, mournful cry, and she wondered if it was beckoning her towards an unseen future. By the spring of 1948, the atmosphere in Annalise's village resonated with a different cadence. The rhythmic striking of hammers against nails, the rasping of saws through timber, and the effervescent laughter of children replaced the former reign of silence. The schoolhouse, a testament to her rebuilding efforts, stood prominently at the heart of the community, its bell tolling at midday, a symbol of resolute perseverance. However, beneath the veneer of this quiet renewal, the global order was undergoing another transformation. The Cold War had transcended mere discourse in the press. It had become an encroaching shadow stretching eastward, its chill felt keenly by the villagers. Soviet influence exerted pressure from beyond the border, and rumors of arrests and disappearances in the eastern territories filtered through like wisps of smoke. The very individuals who had once uttered curses against American soldiers now turned to them with weary gratitude, as if their former adversaries had become a protective bulwark. Annalise was no longer the hesitant young woman who had disembarked from the train that bleak winter. clutching her suitcase as if it were a lifeline. She moved through the village with newfound purpose, her posture erect, her hair neatly tied back, her hands calloused from labor. Her confinement in the camp had not only reshaped her perspective of the world, but it also instilled in her a sense of personal agency she had never previously experienced. When she spoke, her words commanded attention, not through volume, but through the gravitas of someone who had directly confronted the enemy and returned with more than just lingering resentment. Correspondence from America continued to arrive, conveying snippets of news from the Nebraska farm, details of local gatherings, and observations of the changing seasons beneath the expansive prairie sky. The medic's handwriting had become more familiar to her than her own, and each envelope felt like a fragile connection stretched across the vast expanse of the ocean. On one occasion, a package arrived containing a tin of coffee and a photograph. Though slightly blurred, it clearly depicted the farm laborers gathered before a combine harvester. He was present in the image, still in uniform, his smile conveying a relaxed ease that stirred something within her. She placed the photograph on the mantelpiece, where her mother observed it with a blend of curiosity and quiet approval. The village itself was undergoing a metamorphosis, not solely in its physical reconstruction, but also in its collective spirit. The inhabitants had been hardened by privation and sorrow. Yet, as American aid, in the form of provisions, machinery, and educational materials, began to flow in, they started to look outward once more. Children embraced learning English phrases, proudly exclaiming, "Good morning," to Allied officers. Farmers spoke of revived markets and the prospect of exporting grain beyond their borders. Life, which had been reduced to mere survival, was beginning to expand. However, not everyone was readily embracing this new future. In dimly lit taverns, hushed murmurs persisted that Germany had been subjected to humiliation, and that no act of kindness could erase the inherent shame. Some even cautioned that the Americans were merely substituting one form of dominion for another, suggesting that their confections and literature represented a subtler guise of occupation. Annalise listened to these pronouncements, but found the familiar arguments lacking conviction. She had witnessed the devastating consequences of animosity, and could not countenance a return to such sentiments. One crisp autumn day, a delegation from the American administration arrived in the village to assess the progress of the reconstruction program. Trucks laden with supplies rumbled into the square, accompanied by soldiers and officers in pristine uniforms. Among them was a figure Annalise recognized, who dismounted and cast a weary glance around the bustling scene. Annalise's breath hitched involuntarily. It was Harris, no longer the lieutenant who had patrolled in dusty boots, but a man exuding a calm assurance, the bearing of one who had faced adversity and chosen steadfastness. Their gazes met across the square, and for a fleeting moment, the din of the vehicles and the clamor of the children receded. They spoke later, standing near the partially rebuilt church, as villagers unloaded crates of flour. He inquired about the schoolhouse, the harvest, and the prevailing mood among the populace. She responded deliberately, her words measured, aware that he was not merely seeking information, but also discerning the nascent signs of hope. When he mentioned the potential for educational programs aimed at young women, a spark ignited within her. She readily offered her assistance, volunteering to translate and encourage others to participate. He smiled, the same quiet smile she recalled from that stormy night in the camp, and she felt a subtle shift beneath her feet, as if the very ground had tilted. Winter returned, harsh and biting, but this time the village was better prepared. They possessed sufficient fuel to heat the schoolhouse and enough provisions to sustain them through February. On Christmas Eve, the children sang carols in both German and halting English, their voices ascending into the snow-laden night. Annalise stood at the rear of the chapel, listening, her hands clasped. For a brief interval, she was transported back to Nebraska, recalling the guards strumming their guitars and the women's voices harmonizing beneath the starlit sky. The memory no longer inflicted pain. It imparted warmth. The advent of the new year heralded further transformations. Roads were repaired, commercial activities resumed, and for the first time, the future appeared as something that could be actively shaped rather than merely endured. Annalise commenced conducting English lessons twice weekly, utilizing worn textbooks dispatched from overseas. She found fulfillment in observing the children repeat words, their tongues stumbling, but their eagerness palpable. She also shared narratives, recounting tales of the farms, the expansive skies, and the benevolence of strangers who had once been deemed enemies. The children listened with wide-eyed wonder, as if she were describing an alien world. Then arrived the letter that irrevocably altered the course of events. It was longer than her usual correspondence, penned in meticulous script. In it, the medic extended an invitation for her to return, not merely for a visit, but to reside for a period and assist in aiding displaced persons, thereby bridging two worlds. He had secured a sponsorship, he explained, and the decision rested entirely with her. That evening, she remained by the stove long after her mother had retired, her gaze fixed upon the letter. The prospect of departing once more, of traversing the ocean to the land where she had first begun to perceive the world differently, evoked a mixture of yearning and apprehension. Could she abandon this village that she had played a role in resurrecting? Could she forsake her mother, the school, and the fragile new existence they had painstakingly established? The weight of this decision preoccupied her for weeks. She walked the fields alone, the frost crunching beneath her boots, the sky a vast, pale expanse above. Each path she traversed seemed to lead her back to the same contemplation, the memory of standing at the camp's perimeter, gazing out at the open road, contemplating the potential taste of freedom. She had been granted a second opportunity once before. Now, another awaited her. When spring finally unfurled, heralding the emergence of the first delicate green shoots, she made her choice. At the village council meeting, she rose and declared her intention to depart for America, not as an escape, but as a means of carrying a part of their collective spirit with her. "They treated us with dignity when we had none left," she stated. "If I can help others understand that we are no longer adversaries, then the journey is worthwhile." The departure on this occasion bore no resemblance to the one that had preceded it. There were no guards, no growling truck engines, no sense of coercion. The entire village convened to bid her farewell, pressing gifts into her hands, scarves, bread, letters destined for relatives in distant locales. Her mother held her tightly, whispering words of pride. As the train gradually pulled away, Annalise leaned out the window, waving until the figures on the platform blurred into the distance. The transatlantic voyage was more placid this time, and she frequently stood on deck, the wind playfully tousling her hair, her gaze fixed upon the horizon. She no longer felt like an internee embarking on an uncertain destiny. She was a messenger, a witness to something that had its origins in captivity, but had blossomed into liberation. Upon setting foot on American soil once more, the air carried the mingled scents of salt and coal, and somewhere in the distance, a whistle blew, sharp and clear. She thought of the camp, now dismantled, its fences removed, its barracks empty. She recalled the geraniums blooming outside the barrack doors, vibrant against the dust, and a sudden, profound sense of gratitude washed over her. The war had exacted a heavy toll, but it had also bestowed upon her this: an opportunity to rebuild not only her village, but also herself. Months later, standing beneath the immense Nebraska sky, she revisited the farm where she had once labored. The fields unfurled in verdant waves, and the wind carried the same sweet, dusty aroma. Children ran past, their laughter echoing, and she felt the past and present converge, becoming indistinguishable. The medic approached and stood beside her, his hands in his pockets, and for a considerable interval, they simply surveyed the landscape. "It feels different," she remarked at length. "No," he replied softly. "You feel different." A smile then graced her lips, the kind of smile that emanates from having navigated profound adversity and discovered that the world can still hold beauty. The sun descended, bathing the fields in a golden hue, and in that light, everything seemed attainable. The fences were gone, but the memory of them had transmuted into a bridge. Somewhere far away, Germany was rising from its ashes. Here, the prairie wind swept like a solemn hymn, carrying forward the narrative of women who had crossed an ocean as adversaries and returned as something far more enduring, allies. And as the last vestiges of daylight bled into the horizon, Annalise perceived the future unfolding before her, as boundless as the land itself, awaiting her passage.